was a number of things that essentially just came straight out of the whole underground mushroom cultivation community. And this kind of gets a little bit left, a little bit ignored. People kind of will mention it in books, but when people are not ever really very clear about the fact that they came from magic mushroom cultivation.
Every now and then, if he's way off screen, just,
It all started with this chap. This is Roger Heim. On the 18th of May in 1956, at 1 a.m. in the morning, Roger Heim consumed 120 grams of fresh Stropharia cubensis, as it was known at the time. So this was fresh mushrooms that he'd grown in his lab in Paris. And as far as we know, this was the first time that anyone had ever cultivated Stropharia cubensis indoors in a sterile environment. So he proceeded to eat his 120 grams slowly, piecemeal by piecemeal, and he had an amazing time. It was really quite visionary for him, and by sunrise, which was, I think it was about 5 a.m. in the morning at that time, he was aware of all the colours. He was aware of just the nature of the experience that we all kind of are fascinated by now. 2 months later, he was in Oaxaca having a ceremony with Maria Sabina. He was so taken by this experience that it ended up then dominating his career for pretty well the rest of his life. He was fascinated by this particular group of mushrooms. So in 1957, he and a colleague, Roger Calieu, then went ahead and cultivated numerous species of psilocybe. So Heim had gone to Oaxaca. He joined Valentina and Gordon Wasson on their journey through Oaxaca, trying to identify the mushrooms that were being used in ceremonies in that region. Their whole journey was to try to identify mushrooms that had been used traditionally and the different ways that had been used, particularly in spiritual contexts. They had invited Heim to help with editing their book, Mushrooms, Russia and History, that they were working on at the time. And hence, they then sent him spore prints that he could work with, and then when he kind of had messaged back going, okay, that was interesting, they invited him to then join their expedition. And this all culminated in 1958 with Les Champignons hallucinogènes du Mexique, which was published as part of the Editions de Muséum National de Histoire Naturelle in Paris. A big problem with this book was it was all in French. It just got lost to history. It's an absolutely amazing text. It covers everything from the ethnobotany, ethnology, anthropology, the mycology. It includes all of the papers on their lab techniques that they then used to grow the mushrooms. Part of this also was, it was Heim that supplied Albert Hoffman with the mushrooms that he then went ahead and used to analyse to determine the structure of psilocybin. And from there, Hoffman also used Heim's technique to then go ahead and cultivate them himself as well, in order to help solidify that synthesis process. A few little side notes. In 1964, Carl Formo and Tyler demonstrated that psilocybe could be grown in liquid culture. This was quite a significant thing that we'll come back to later. And then and I'm jumping forward a little bit here. In 1971, JP San Antonio also demonstrated that you could grow psilocybe on cased rye grain. Haydn was a formal mycologist, taxonomist, and worked within a very, very structured lab environment. So he was streaking spores onto agar in sterile environments and then going from spores onto sterile media and then fruiting in a sterile environment. But he also experimented with trying to grow them in non-sterile environments. So myceliating non-sterile composts and then growing them within earthenware pots in a greenhouse to try to get a little bit more of a naturalistic kind of feel to, was there anything about doing it that maybe altered the chemistry of the mushrooms. Again, the lab techniques that emerged at this time were liquid culture and cased rye grains. In 1957, Gordon Wasson published his Life magazine article, and this triggered a worldwide fascination with the genus Psilocybe. This is the middle piece of that article, showing all the different types of Psilocybe that Haim had been collecting in Oaxaca. So everything from cubensis to caerulescens and Psilocybe mexicana. Gordon Wasson, who kind of took the lead on the project, but it was actually his wife who was really the intellectual powerhouse. She was the one who was doing all of the work, writing Mushrooms, Russia and History. She was the one who had been connecting Gordon with all of the academics that they'd been in touch with throughout that time period. So we're talking like Richard Evans Schultes, Roger Haim, and a few other academics. She published her own article, and it ended up being a really tiny little thing in a woman's magazine called This Week, called Ate the Sacred Mushroom, which was published about a week later than Gordon Seeking the Magic Mushroom, which has become quintessentially famous within the Psilocybe community. It was really quite sad because Valentina Wasson passed away in 1958 from cancer. In 1958, as I've already mentioned, Howard Hoffman identified psilocybin and psilocin as the active compounds. Hoffman needs no introduction, but he was working with Sandoz, and Sandoz took that process and then they started manufacturing psilocybin for research. Timothy Leary, as part of that research community, was aware of LSD, but he also became aware of psilocybin and fascinated by this narrative around the traditional use. He himself travelled to Huatla de Jimenez to do a ceremony with Maria Sabina in the early 60s. Numerous other people followed him, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and it all slowly turned into a really sad narrative of kind of cultural appropriation and misuse of these traditional techniques. Timothy Leary wrote about this experience in High Priest in 1968. In 1968, Carlos Castaneda, and this is an interesting individual, published his book Teachings of Don Juan. These were the two first occasions where psilocybin was really promoted in a mass media sense, particularly in the Teachings of Don Juan case. This book sold millions. People were fascinated by it. It really launched an interest in ethnobotany, in the use of traditional plants, so peyote, datura, psilocybin, within a younger community, within the countercultural community at the time. There were problems at the same time. And excuse my French, but this evil motherfucker had a lot to answer for. Sandoz stopped production of LSD and psilocybin in 1965. The countercultural movement, everything that was happening culturally kind of started to spark a bit of a scare with the larger kind of structures, social structures at the time. LSD became illegal in the US and the UK in the late 1960s. Nixon in 1970 signed the Controlled Substances Act that made these essentially then Schedule I substances, meaning that they had a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. The equivalent in Australia is Schedule 9. Pretty much every country in the world followed this example that the United States has set. So what happened? The whole thing went underground. Hippies are fairly self-sufficient. They like to kind of work things out themselves and, you know, how can we grow this? How can we do that? So in 1968, kind of in response to this emerging legal problem, groups of people started getting together and forming these little communities and societies based around the use of traditional plants, traditional medicines. This book in particular, The Psychedelic Guide to the Preparation of the Eucharist in a few of its many guises, was the first book to really, first published book that really sought to help the underground counterculture in this sense of self-sufficiency with accessing their own entheogens, to the point of teaching people how to cultivate things like marijuana, peyote, ergot, and mushrooms. Notably, it also included instructions for the synthesis of the said compounds in these plants, so mescaline, LSD, and psilocybin, and also how to set up your lab equipment as well. It was really quite ahead of its time, and also kind of sparked a whole other kind of side narrative of synthesis books. Alexander Shulgin, for example, would fit within this as a later example, but there were numerous other chemists who were doing stuff in the underground. Your Uncle Festus and a few other notable individuals. I meant to have another picture here as well, but this is kind of the page about psilocybin culture. But they were already working with liquid cultures at this point within this group. So they were really quite advanced and really quite progressive in terms of trying to help demonstrate and teach people how to access psilocybin. It kind of became clear at this point that it was going to be Psilocybe cubensis that was going to be the primary species. There are a couple of others that are going to pop up, but cubensis is super easy to cultivate. It's pretty well now, for us, the most recognized magic mushroom. At the time, there were other mushrooms that were kind of recognized, but and us now, when people say magic mushroom, they think Psilocybe cubensis. These really large, fat mushrooms with this gold cap with the beautiful specks of partial veil, as illustrated here. This is a beautiful grow. It's easily cultivated. The McKenna brothers, Pollock, and numerous others took advantage of this in their own publications, and I'm going to mention a few of those. Over the decades, numerous strains have emerged. Golden Teacher, Peanut Envy, The Enigma, there's a few others. Hundreds of others. I shouldn't understate that. Psilocybin is also widely regarded as very safe. I think by this point they have kind of identified that. Psilocybin's pretty safe. It doesn't have a lot of health risks. And I guess probably as a connecting point between then and now, psilocybe cubensis itself is pretty safe. There's no other risks associated with it, not like the wood-level paralysis that we now know occurs with species like psilocybe aeruginosa. It's quite variable, but its potency versus its size makes it a nice mushroom to work with. It's not too potent, it has a bit of mass, you can microdose with it, you can work out your museum doses versus your day-type doses versus your heroic doses fairly easily. We're now currently in a really beautiful time where with decriminalisation in America, we're seeing people grow their strains and are able to get them identified through groups like Oakland High Fate. We're getting a really good idea of the range of psilocybin and the other compounds versus the strains. There's definitely a growing research area, and there's probably a lot more narratives to come out of that. The early 70s saw the emergence of a number of other zine-type little booklets. Most notable were the 1970 Leonard Enos book, Key to the American Psilocybin Mushroom, which covered what species were present in America at the time, and then the 1972 Gould Field Guide to the Psilocybin Mushroom, which is this tan-coloured book here on the right-hand side. Both books were very basic guides. They communicated some really in-depth technical knowledge, but in a bad way. So some people were able to kind of get their head around it. For the average person who picked these up thinking they might be able to grow magic mushrooms, it didn't really quite work out. There were also a few mistakes, notably in the identification. A lot of mushrooms were incorrectly identified. And some of the technical details were also incorrect. Some of it was probably also clearly borrowed from books like Eucharist, and Eucharist wasn't the only book. It was the first, but there were other books that followed that example. And hence why you also have narratives of Banana Dream. There was another book that came out and included the synthesis of a number of just nonsense compounds that don't exist. Things got a little interesting in the 70s. In 1971, the brothers Terence and Dennis McKenna arrived in South America. They were looking for a kuhei, which was an orally active version of DMT. But they arrived in La Chorrera, which was a little town with a mission on the side of the Putumayo River, which was on the border of Colombia and Peru. The two brothers had a really quite exceptional experience here. They were looking for a kuhei, they were looking for ayahuasca. Instead, they discovered psilocybe cubensis. They also discovered the logos. Whatever happened, whatever experiment it was that they had and experienced, Dennis ended up being able to communicate with the universe in ways that neither brother had ever experienced before, and was trying to communicate all this stuff to Terence. It all just got messed up. But the two brothers, well, how can we reproduce this? How can we grow these mushrooms ourselves? And then took a lot of spore prints back to the United States with them. This experience formed the foundation of Terence McKenna's philosophy. And one of the speakers in an hour or two's time, Graham St. John, is going to talk about Terence McKenna himself, so I won't go too far. But essentially, Terence was looking for the eschaton, the transcendental object at the end of time, and this led a lot of his narratives. I'm sure Graham will correct me. But the McKenna brothers returned from the Amazon with a whole range of small prints. Some of these they kept for themselves, their own experiments, and some were also distributed to other interested cultivators. As a PhD student, Dennis was able to access a lot of academic research, stuff that was not accessible to other people at the time. And because he was motivated and interested, probably had the energy and the patience to look these things up and really go deep on it. This work led to the 1976 publication, Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. They published it under the pseudonymous names Oss and Eric. The book was illustrated by Kathleen Harrison, who was Terence McKenna's wife at the time. This is the 1976 cover, and this is the 1995 cover, or 1985 cover, sorry, or 86 cover. It was pretty much a work of philosophy, hence that was Terence's contribution to this, and cultivation. Dennis definitely deserves a credit here, and in terms of having gone ahead and done all the academic work and worked out how to do it, and then essentially leaving Terence to go ahead, also work it out himself, and then write about it. They even got a write-up in High Times magazine in June 1976. The takeaway from the McKenna's work, their experiments at the time, was you can do this at home with enough patience and a consistent technique. You can grow your own Solus cubensis. A lot of the techniques in the 70s, pretty much everybody was growing out of mason jars at the time. The McKennas notably used rye grains, which I think I've mentioned before, and also casing layers. So accessing those previous techniques from academics who had been working in the field, they then apply these in a little bit more of a home-style practical method. They were using household pressure cookers and still air boxes, or glove box is the other term for it. And this is what a glove box looks like. It's a box with a glass cover. It's got space for your hands. With enough mucking around, you can attach some gloves to this, and you can then sterilize the inside of the box so that you can work with inside the box in a sterile fashion, pseudo lab style. I mentioned some of the earlier 70s zine type things, and this was part of the problem, that they skipped the aseptic technique that's necessary to be able to go from spores to agar to spawn to then being able to grow. Anyone who's grown mushrooms will know how manky your grow can go if you're not clean, if you're not careful. Things from that point essentially took off. In 1976, Bob Harris published his book, Growing Wild Mushrooms. This was kind of a nice little book at the time. It had a little bit more of a practical feel, like how you can grow outdoors, how you can be a little bit more guerrilla in your grow techniques. But like other books, it was full of taxonomic errors, still rudimentary, but otherwise useful. In 1977, Jules Stevens and Rich Gear published How to Identify and Grow Psilocybin Mushrooms. Notably, the spores came from Terence McKenna. And it was Rich G who is known as the original cultivator of PE. So they'd been growing these spores that they'd gotten from Terrence. And at some point, and they were doing it properly, they were making spore prints and putting those away. But at some point they lost their entire grow. Anyone who's grown a lot of mushrooms will probably have lost their entire grow at some point. And they had to go back. So they went back to some of their older spore prints, and then Rich G got some mutants. And it's from those mutants that PE then evolved. And this is the book, How to Identify and Grow Psilocybin Mushrooms. This book has early photos of the early stages of penis envy. In 1977, Stephen Pollock published Magic Mushroom Cultivation. Pollock was a legend. Pollock was absolutely fascinated by mushrooms. He'd been working for years, like his work predates the McKennas. It's just that he never got to publish till after the McKennas. So he kind of lost a little bit of that oomph that the McKennas got with their book. But he'd been working for years. He had his own little van, he had a mobile mycology lab, and he was driving around the country looking for really interesting psilocybes and then trying to cultivate them. I can't remember, I think it was 1975, Pollock rediscovered Psilocybe tamponensis. I say rediscovered because someone else had already found it, published, and at some point Psilocybe tamponensis is going to be renamed because we now know it was named something else previously. That's how taxonomy works and gets confusing. But Pollock and his friend Gary Linkoff were attending a mycology conference at the time in Tampa, Florida. Pollock was bored and he essentially said, "Hey, Gary, let's go for an adventure," and they skived off up the coast and were just wandering around some grass fields and they found Psilocybe tamponensis. Sadly, the Pollock story ended in 1983. He was murdered under suspicious circumstances, and Hamilton Morris actually did a lot of work in trying to uncover what exactly happened. Never really found out what had happened, but sadly we lost this fascinating chap to an unfortunate circumstance. The takeaways though from Pollock ended up being far more influential in time than Olson Uhrig. Largely because of, and I'll come back to some point, he used a variety of cereal grains, but he decided on whole grain rice as his primary substrate. He used a variety of composts. He also experimented with growing psilocybe with a variety of species, so psilocybe and Paniolus. Anyone looking at what's going on in the psilocybe cultivation community at the moment will know that Paniolus is the hot thing and definitely worth investigating. He also used boxes rather than the mason jars in order to then cultivate some of his mushrooms. Into the late 70s, things started getting really quite active in the underground mushroom cultivation community. In 1978, Ott and Bigwood, Jonathan Ott, who passed away last year, they published Tea Nanocuttle, hallucinogenic mushrooms of North America. And this was published as extracts from the Second International Conference on Hallucinogenic Mushrooms. The first international conference had happened in 1976 and included people like Gaston Guzman, Gordon Wasson, Stephen Pollock, Bigwood, and of course the notable Paul Stamets. The second international conference happened in 1977, and presenters included, again, Gaston Guzman. He was the leading expert at the time. Gordon Lawson, Albert Hoffman travelled over to attend. Richard Evans Schultes was also in attendance, as was Carl Rook, Andrew Weil, and again Jeremy Binwood. This is a fascinating little book. It covers a history of cultivation to the time, an essay on cultivation and cultivation techniques. It's very dry, it's very kind of lab heavy, and probably not the easiest thing to follow, but it was an important document for the time. It also included the identification summaries by Jonathan Ott, and kind of from that point kind of marks it as a really nice piece for what species were present in the US at the time, and how things were then probably going to change over time. These conferences then led to further conferences run by people like Paul Stamets and Jeff Chilton. So there was 1979, and then Mushrooms 2 held in 1980. Again, politics. Excuse my French again, but this other evil motherfucker changed that whole narrative at the time. By 1980, there was this really flourishing, fascinating group of this community of psychedelic enthusiasts and amateur mycologists. Some of them not so amateur. But Reagan forced all these communities underground again. He was definitely not a fan of drugs, and you know, the whole saying no to drugs campaign came out of his politics. Some of the not so amateur mycologists decided to pursue above ground businesses, using some examples as some species examples. So for cultivation, so a lot of exotic mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, shiitake, enoki were all becoming quite popular at the time. But also some were then talking about guerrilla techniques as well, so techniques that would then go on to be used by the so-called groups in the 2020s, the group referred to as knockers, who go around inoculating wood chips with spawn, so that interesting wood chip mushrooms can grow. The person I'm referring to mostly in this case is, of course, Paul Stamets. In 1984, Stamets and his colleague Jeff Chilton published The Mushroom Cultivator. Stamets' Blue Book is still used as a common textbook in a lot of home labs. It is not thorough in the sense that his other books are, but it's pretty good. It covers everything from agar, liquor cultures, through to spawn. You could use this book to set up your own small mushroom company and do it quite successfully, just following this book. He does also include outdoor techniques. In order to get around the legal issues at the time, his primary focus was exotic edibles. Oyster mushrooms, shiitake, and enoki were all seen as quite exotic at the time, but there were lots of people who were taking an interest in them and wanted to be able to grow them for restaurant culinary, or just out of interest. The Stamets collection, so The Mushroom Cultivator was the first book, and then in the mid-90s he published Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms, and this thing is a tome. It's an entire industry manual, essentially. Fabulous book. It covers everything. Yeah, everything. And then in the mid-2000s, Stamets published Mycelium Running, going back to his roots, talking about really hands-on guerrilla techniques, growing mushrooms in wood chips, and a lot of the research that was interesting at the time, but sort of problematic. Stamets is really good at collecting patents. He also likes to sell himself, and sadly there's a lack of research in some of the aspects that he pushes through. But things like microremediation really grew out of this particular book. By the 90s, things were starting to pick up again in the underground community. There were lots of mail order spore businesses, and grow kits were becoming popular. You could purchase a High Times magazine, you could go to the back pages, and there were numerous advertisements for buying spores or kits. In the early 90s, this interesting chap who referred to himself as Psilocybe fanaticus introduced the world to the PF technique, which is essentially a self-sufficient method to produce shrooms. I'm going to come back to the PF technique in a minute because it does deserve further discussion. By 1992, even the fabulous Furry Freak brothers were describing how to cultivate Psilocybe cubensis. Who's read a fabulous Furry Freak brothers comic? I only saw one hand. Any more? Okay. These are fabulous comics, and anyone into psychedelics or drug culture, they're a great read. Fortunately, nothing like the last panel has ever occurred. We have not had, even though maybe some of us might enjoy this, but there's been no mutant psychedelic fungus overrunning our cities. Another notable 1990s publication was by Rush Wayne. And this is something that I teach quite often in my workshops. Rush Wayne discovered a method of using hydrogen peroxide to inoculate his substrates in order to get around contamination. So you can add hydrogen peroxide to your agar or to your spawn, and it stops spore germination. Now, that might be a problem if you're trying to germinate the spores from your said species, but if you're just trying to transfer the mycelium itself, that's fine, and you can do it quite easily. It's a great technique, and I'm back on Sunday morning with a colleague to explain the hydrogen peroxide method as a really nice introduction to kitchen-style lab techniques. I mentioned the PF tech. This is the PF tech. It's essentially just a combination of brown rice flour. So when Fanaticus first started creating this technique, he was basing it on Pollock's technique of just using whole grain rice. But he found that it was kind of unworkable for his own way of working, and he instead decided to try brown rice flour, and he mixed it with vermiculite, and it worked an absolute treat. So the vermiculite allows airspace within the flour. Normally the flour would kind of compact, you wouldn't have the air spaces for the mycelium to run. Mycelium loves airspace, and it loves to run through its substrate. But essentially the recipe is no more than just 1 part of brown rice flour to 1 part water to 2 parts vermiculite. You add them all to a bowl, you mix it up, you put them in, you then fill some mason jars. You also, and as I haven't included it here, but it is illustrated here, there's a vermiculite layer of the substrate, and that acts as a barrier to contamination. Vermiculite has no nutrients whatsoever. Spores will land on it and not germinate. But the whole method was essentially to then inject the spores that you got from your mail order kit that you might have purchased, let those then germinate, myceliate the substrate, and then when it was fully colonized, you could just tap it out of the jar and the mushrooms would just grow off the cake. Psilocybe fanaticus promoted this sense of self-sufficiency. You grow your own mushrooms, you can then make your own really nice, clean, sterile spore prints. You can then use those spores to germinate, to inoculate further PF-Tech jars. So essentially, harvest, spore print, repeat. And it was a fabulous method that allowed a lot of people to just jump into this hobby, grow their own mushrooms, and then when they were ready, they could then pursue further research. This is a shotgun terrarium. This is what you would typically then grow your cakes in. The perlite allows humidity, so you can put your cake within the shotgun terrarium and the mushrooms would just grow. The holes allowed a little bit of air movement, and in order to then also for the humidity as well. Into the 2000s, we then have the digital communities, online communities like the Shroomery, Mycotopia really boomed. Individuals like Hippie3, who was the admin of Mycotopia, invented a thing called the airport lid, which allowed people to then use liquid cultures within a kitchen environment. So starting to come full circle back to some of these techniques that Heim was pushing, and a few others, in terms of liquid culture and how to use that in a home environment. Previously it had been really hard. Liquid culture contaminates super quickly, super easily, and was always problematic unless you were super clean, super sterile. Vendors like Sporeworks, Hawk's Eye were selling spores, but also selling spores of new species. There were new species popping up, and it was during this time the commercial production of mushroom stones or philosopher's stones from Psilocybe tamponensis became a big thing, particularly in the Netherlands. They were able to get around a particular wording within the law. You couldn't grow the mushrooms, but you could grow the mycelium. The sclerotia, the mushroom stones, they'd simply just compact mycelium, so they were illegal to grow underneath that jurisdiction. This was a period that there were endless Psilocybe cubensis cultivars being released as well. The only real notable book to come out at this time was a psilocybin mushroom handbook. By this time, everything had pretty well shifted online. People were communicating, people were sharing ideas, things were evolving quite rapidly. Your monotub, for example, came out of this community, and numerous variations on this idea of having a plastic tub with large air holes that then allow mushrooms just to grow from the substrate that had been placed within the bottom of the tub. So instead of cakes, you were using an entire tub to then have your substrate grow your mushrooms. This allowed bulk grows. Not just a few mushrooms off one cake, but heaps, maybe 10, 20, 30 mushrooms off your substrate. Near the end of that decade, we saw the emergence of radical mycology, so the Spore Liberation Front emerged. Founded in 2006, they published their zine in 2009. A little book called Radical Mycology. It was a free to distribute book covering ID, cultivation and community. The group was led by Peter McCoy, and the group really worked hard to radicalise mycology, to make it more modern, to make it accessible to younger people, to people who were put off by all the taxonomic details, all the technical details, a very, very academic, lab-heavy approach. They wanted people to be able to go out and use mycelium and fungi practical ways in the world. This little pamphlet was then followed in 2015 by a 700-page monolithic book that covered everything from species concepts through cultivation, mushroom extracts, etc. I'd highly recommend it. It's a fabulous book. And these are the three McCoy books: A Radical Mycology, as the Spore Liberation Front primer, through to the 700-page book, to the Mycocultural Revolution. If you don't want to invest in the 700-page book, the little red book is really lovely and really quite accessible. Notable recent contributions: so in 2016, Hayes and Mandrake published the Psilocybin Mushroom Bible, now in a second edition. This is the tome for now. This is our contemporary tome. It covers pretty much everything I've spoken about tonight. So everything again from liquid culture to agar through to different ways of cultivation. Lots of harm reduction information. There's even a little chapter on woodlover paralysis in order to then cover, this wide range of issues that are emerging. And then there's a whole bunch of courses that have appeared online as well, so Double Blind, Third Way, etc. I've also done cultivation courses. I think Entheogenesis Australis is looking at a cultivation course in the near future, so keep an eye on that one. Other books, not so psychedelic, but highly helpful, and these individuals have also contributed to current mushroom cultivation in big ways. Trade Cotto with his book, Organic Mushroom Farming and Microremediation. This is lovely and really works hard at explaining how to grow in an outdoor environment. Milkwood by Kirsten Bradley and Nick Ritar is also a really, really good book. It's a really nice introduction to oyster mushroom cultivation in particular. I've already mentioned Mycocultural Revolution, and then there's a lovely little book called The Wakeful Mushroom Cultivation Journal that I recommend purchasing, but perhaps it's just me. And that's pretty much the end of my talk.
This is the active part of the lecture where we come to you. Alright, so here's got a question. We've got about 10 minutes. So, anyone? Anyone? Here we go. Good question. Hope you've been taking photos. Kane?
Hello? Yep, yeah, this is me. Yeah, I should have said that at the beginning. Just feel free to take photos.
Will you send to me on YouTube?
This talk will be available on YouTube apparently. Yeah, as part of the Mardi Gras YouTube channel, I think.
So, if you give me your slides, I can dub your voice over the slides and put it on the YouTube.
Okay.
It'll be advertised on the Nimbin Mardi Gras newsletter.
It'll be growing here soon. Okay, do we have any questions?
Maybe in time we can do a version of this for EGA. I might keep the end.
You know I'm always soft on that. I have a question for Kane if no one else does. Oh, here we go. Another friend of the family, Liam. Here we go. So it's very hot, this mic.
Hi Kane, that was great, thanks. I was wondering if you could give a bit more on, you were talking about the genus Pinaleus being currently hot. I'd like to know a bit more about this heat, if you will, please.
What's going on with this one, Kane?
So Psilocybe paniolus is an allied species to Psilocybe. It has the same gene cluster from Psilocybe genus. At some point there's been horizontal gene transfer to an environmental transfer from Psilocybe. We suspect Psilocybe cubensis. We're not 100% on that. But it means that paniolus, so Paniolus cyanesis, and there's a couple of others, are able to produce psilocybin. Now, people have been cultivating these for quite some time. So, as I mentioned, Steve Pollock was cultivating them, but people have recently taken up an interest in these again and are now growing them. And there was the psilocybin cup, or one of the association cups, did a test recently, and one of the samples came back, I think it was 6.5% psilocybin. This is a lot. And we suspect that the mushrooms don't have the same limiting factor that psilocybe do. Psilocybe seem to have a limiting factor where they stop production of psilocybin. It's not viable for their metabolism to just keep producing it, so they stop. And this might be part of the, whatever psilocybin is used for, evolved for. But paniolus seem to be really potent. And so there's a lot of people overseas, but also notably in Australia. There's some really, really potent paniolus being grown here. And species from northern New South Wales in particular seem to be potent, but also potentially different. There is suspicion that maybe some of them have a different chemo profile. There might be more aerogenicin or something. It's a different experience. There's a little bit of conjecture in that, though.
All right.
Mushroom people are mushroom people.
All right. Question? Okay, this microphone's very hot.
Thank you, very interesting. I'm wondering if you think that Mr. Trump's signing of an executive order last week will have any great impact within across the world in the way people look at psychedelics. Have you had time to have any of that discussion?
Whoa, that's a sensitive topic. I'm not a fan of Trump. I'm not a fan of the politics that occur around this. I have my own thoughts around whether, in what context are they talking about psychedelics, and is it for healing, or is it more? Are there more commercial prospects that are going to come out of that? Like wellness to maintain people in a very uncomfortable 9-to-5 job, or getting soldiers back on the front line as soon as possible through psychedelic treatments, or even helping to push media consumption. It feels to me a lot like, are we heading towards the Soma of Brave New World, is my own feeling on this. I have concerns about capitalism taking on psychedelics and pushing it in a cultural context. I love the idea of the healing aspect of this. I just don't like the capitalism. But that's me.
But you've had too many mushrooms, dude.
Yeah, I've taken too many mushrooms, man.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. Here we are.
Thank you. My question is about, forgive my ignorance, about paralysis. Can you please speak into, I'm sure you said something about paralysis?
Yep.
Can you please speak
I'm
into
happy
that?
to speak to wood lover paralysis. So woodlobe paralysis is a temporary paralysis that occurs when people consume some specimens of Psilocybe tuberculosa. So you will take your dose, and then within about 3 to 4 hours, you'll start to notice the paralysis of your extremities, so your hands and feet. And this can develop into being unable to use your legs or your arms, in extreme cases, your mouth, and even breathing. It's been implicated in a few hospitalizations now, and it's concerning. It's concerning because it has, for a long time we feel it was written off as just too high, but we now have fairly good evidence that this is a particular syndrome or a toxidrome that occurs through the consumption of mushrooms from this particular group, but only the Seberogenosa group. The paralysis doesn't occur in any other species. It has been identified in Psilocybe subterraneans, but that's very rare. Hence also the whole thing about cubensis being really safe. And that's why the Oregon, the committee that was trying to work out the safety profiles for mushrooms growing in America decided on cubensis as the species that should be growing, because there are too many concerns about woodlobe paralysis being an issue.
Very rare, but very serious.
Very rare. It is rare, but it is serious when it does happen.
We have 1 minute, and this is a cultural talk. So can you tell us a little bit about the introduction of psilocybin in Australia, maybe just keeping it to the first decade so that we can answer it in 2 minutes?
The introduction of psilocybe to
The discovering of tripping in Australia through mushrooms, magic mushroom tripping.
and that's another talk.
Okay. We'll come back tomorrow then.
Well,
Just tell us when do we believe this happened?
Look, Psilocybe cubensis was known to have been found in Australia in... I think that's another talk, Ronnie.
Okay, no worries.
Let's come back to that
Let's
another time.
put another hand
Maybe
together.
next year.
Put a hand together for Kane Barlow. Thank you very much. Now.